Welcome. I'm Tom Tweed. I have a joint appointment in American Studies and History. I'm associated with Latino Studies and Peace Studies, and one day, I hope, with KEO. It's my honor to preside at this session on ecological conversion as we explore the role of faith in development. The Latin root of the word conversion suggests it's about turning, and this panel convenes theologians and ethicists to engage Laudato Si, of course issued by Pope Francis, the Sustainable Development Goals issued by the United Nations. As we try to ask what faith communities and global citizens are being called to turn toward and turn from. However we imagine that turning, this conference has emphasized again and again, I think, we must be integrative, working to build or rebuild habitats that are just, peaceful, and ecologically sustainable. As Laudato Si points out, we're faced with one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. In turn, strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and protecting nature. Our panelists will talk about how we might begin to do all that. We'll start this afternoon by thinking about the meaning of ecological conversion in Catholic thought, consider resources in Jewish tradition for confronting these morally urgent problems, and conclude by extending our angle of vision still further as we note emerging convergence among faith communities around the world as they collaborate to address social inequality and environmental degradation. Each panelist will speak briefly, and I will be giving severe glances if they do not, which hopefully, just please ignore those. And then we'll have some time for questions. My sense is it might be good to open up to the whole floor for questions earlier, because we want to make sure that we leave time with our beloved colleague Gustavo Gutierrez is speaking here at 5:30, and we want to make sure we clear for that. So let me briefly introduce the panelists. They're all distinguished and deserve many more words of praise, but we'll give you the short version. And they're in the order that they will speak. That's my doing. Celia Deane-Drummond is professor of theology at Notre Dame. She studied everything from plant physiology to systematic theology. Her research and teaching is focused on a number of relevant themes, including environmental ethics and global development. She's authored or co-authored a number of volumes, including Christian Faith in the Earth and Religion and Ecology in the Public Sphere. Matt Axley comes next, chairs Notre Dame's Theology Department. Like Celia, Matt has engaged science, writing about chance and providence in evolution, as well as teaching and writing about everything from mysticism to liberation theology, including a 2015 volume about mysticism and memory, and a co-authored 2014 collection called A Grammar of Justice. Laurie Zoloth is Charles Deering McCormick Professor of Religious Studies at Northwestern University, as well as Professor of Medical Humanities and Bioethics at its medical school. Laurie's contributed to conversation about ethics, science, and social policy. Much of that research has focused on bioethical issues. Laurie's been president of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities, and in 2014, president of the American Academy of Religion. As AAR president, she asked the organization to focus on climate change and took up the topic in her recently published presidential address, Interrupting Your Life and Ethics for the Coming Storm. Finally, Dr. Bill Vendley is the Secretary General of the Religions for Peace International, a position he assumed, I think, in 1994. Is that right, Bill? A theologian, Bill has served as a professor and dean in Roman Catholic schools of theology and is well known for leading the largest multi-religious coalition acting to build peace, eliminate poverty, protect the earth. He's advised a number of governments and helped establish multi-religious councils to resolve conflict and advance development around the world, including in Bosnia, Sierra Leone, Sri Lanka, and the Middle East. As you can tell, we have a distinguished panel. Let's begin with you, Celia. We'll each go in turn, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to the Keogh School and to Scott Appleby for this invitation to be on this panel. It's a great privilege to be here, and I've rewritten my talk several times already since I started listening last night. So I thought I would start with a story, because one of the most formative experiences for me, and what you might call an ecological conversion experience, even though I'd been doing eco-theology for 20-odd years before this, was contact with the Maasai tribe while I was on a theological accompanier with CAFOD, or the Catholic Fund for Overseas Development. While I was working with CAFOD for 12 months, as away from my academic position, we went out to Tanzania and we met some women members of a small Maasai tribe who had been given the means to obtain fresh water. Before that time, their community was full of disease from the water supply that was rapidly running out. Their animals were dying and their communities were dying as well. So it was a question of survival. With very simple technology, CAFOD provided a distillation unit that helped trap the steam coming up from the volcanic areas around where they lived. And that distillation unit provided distilled water, which everyone will know if they have any basic knowledge of science, is completely pure. So that water, as it were, was the means of their survival. And in addition to that, we were struck by the community spirit of that particular community. One person spoke for the whole community, and that woman was incredibly articulate. But she was picked out because she was the very poorest woman in that community, and all the very poorest families were picked out by CAFOD for special attention in this particular project. But they learnt how to manage the bees. I know we've had problems with bees over here, but they learned how to manage bees and honey and sell honey. They learned how to manage veterinary products. They learned how to manage the skins of their goats. And they learned how to manage the water supply so that they could grow maize, and so on and so forth. And they were also converted to Christ some time before. So when we came, they saw us as somehow sent or missionaries from God, which was a very humbling experience. I felt like I had been encountered by someone from the New Testament. That was the extent of their faith. And as I said, the reason I tell this story was because it's not just a one-way traffic, us, as it were, having compassion on the most impoverished people of the world. It's also the other way round. It's us receiving that insight and that knowledge, that sense of how are we to be as communities? How are we to move from our atomistic lifestyles to one that is more holistic? How are we to move from being individualistic to something more socially informed? How are we to think about future generations as well as present generations? And so that movement from, if you like, that atomistic, fragmented, decaying sort of environment to one that respects what you could call authentic human dignity in relationship with the natural world and intertwined with it, is what I think ecological conversion in Catholic social teaching is all about. And the term was first used by Pope John Paul II in 2001 to a sort of general audience, where it was more like a turn to the natural world, or natural environment and environmental responsibility. But a few years later, he started to link this up with human ecology. So the human person is never, as it were, far away from this understanding of ecological conversion. And I'm going to read out a passage from Pastoris Gregis, which is a post-synodical apostolic exhortation, published in 2003. And this is where ecological conversion takes on a new life of its own. So just bear with me as I read this passage. And this is addressed to the bishops of the church. Clearly, and this is Pope John Paul II, in case I've forgotten to tell you that. Clearly, what is called for is not simply a physical ecology concerned with protecting the habitat of various living beings, but a human ecology capable of protecting the radical good of life in all its manifestations and of leaving behind for future generations an environment which conforms as closely as possible to the Creator's plan. There is need for ecological conversion to which the bishops themselves can contribute by their teaching about the correct relationship of human beings with nature. Seen in the light of the doctrine of God the Father, the maker of heaven and earth, this relationship is one of stewardship. Human beings are set at the center of creation as stewards of the Creator. So the question about ecological conversion is the question of proper responsibility for the whole of the created order, humans and other animals and other creatures and the environment all included in a holistic sense. So humanity and ecology are not split apart from one another. So it's not like the turn for caring for the natural environment is somehow detracting from concern for the poorest of the poor. Far from it, it's both considered together at the same time. This conversion process, I think, is at the root of where we need to go. It's not simply identifying moral problems or moral issues, although that's very important. It's thinking about the means to get there, the means of inner change. And the ecumenical patriarchate, Bartholomew I, joined up with John Paul II, and he's also joined up with Pope Francis in 2002, to write a very significant joint statement together, a letter addressed to all people. And they said this: "A solution at the economic and technological level can only be found if we undergo in the most radical way an inner change of heart which can lead to a change in lifestyle and of unsustainable patterns of consumption and production. A genuine conversion in Christ will enable us to change the way we think and act." So that inner change of heart is about an inner change of our desires. And that, I think, is the fundamental root of being able to act morally and appropriately. So it may be a moral issue, but just saying to others this is a moral issue isn't going to make any difference whatsoever. What's needed is a real desire and a desire to change and an openness to change. And in Pope Francis's and John Paul II's minds, and in Bartholomew I's minds, this is also about an openness to Christ. Now, in other religious traditions, it will be something different, but the idea of linking metanoia, or inner change of heart, or conversion, with ecological and more specifically Christological insights is really important. In addition to this, I think wrapped up in these understandings, the concept of mercy comes in, and it's not something that's new for this particular year, 2016. The idea of mercy being linked in with ecological conversion was something that Pope John Paul II also spoke about in his encyclical Dives in Misericordia, which was published in 1980. So this goes back a very long way, and he said this: "The word and concept of mercy seem to come to cause uneasiness in man, who, thanks to the enormous development of science and technology, never before known in history, has become the master of the earth and has subdued and dominated it. This dominion of the earth, sometimes understood in a one-sided and superficial way, seems to leave no room for mercy." That is very close to this understanding of the technological or the technocratic paradigm that Pope Francis criticizes in Laudato Si. And so linked up with mercy is also justice for the earth. So mercy is concerned with justice for the earth, but also justice for others. When we come to think through more clearly about where the distinctions might be with Pope Francis's particular understanding and interpretation of ecological conversions, there are lines of continuity and discontinuity compared to his predecessor. First of all, he is deliberately and outspokenly trying to address this idea of ecological conversion to all people. So it's not just the bishops, as in the pastoral letter that I read earlier, nor is it just a statement to the church, which is more what the joint statement with Bartholomew I was about, but it's addressed to all people. And that's one of the reasons why the Christological theme at the very beginning of the encyclical is downplayed. It only comes up at the very end. So it's, if you like, it's the end point to which this trend it reaches. But it's at all levels that he seeks this conversion experience. It's at the level of the individual desires, which he sees a part of the root of the problem, where the earth has become just a great pile of filth. It's also at the level of indifference to the suffering of others, the suffering of humanity and the suffering of the planet around us and the suffering of other creatures. And it's also an unhealthy attachment to the goods of either wealth or technologies. All these are forms of idolatry, although he doesn't use that particular word. It's implied in my understanding. And that is, as it were, the sticking into the filth, the technology, the inappropriate desire for technologies, the indifference towards the suffering of others, is what we need to move from, and moving towards a celebration of gift of the earth and gift of one another, the gift of inner relationships and the values of those, the gift of understanding ourselves as entangled with each other and with other creatures as well. And that's why biodiversity is emphasized on frequent occasions. It's also about a deeper sensitivity to the sufferings of others. And so the direction of the movement is one that is both religious, but it's also at the same time practical. And so that's what ecological conversion is really all about. The deepest meaning is both profoundly religious, but also profoundly practical at the same time. And so by the end of the encyclical, we have this vision that I'm sure our next speaker will fill out, one of sublime communion. And that vision, as it were, is a religious vision that keeps us like a light at the end of a dark tunnel, somehow keeping going on the way. We heard plenty of stories in the last panel session, stories of both hope and opportunity, but also stories of devastation and disease. And I think without that light at the end of that tunnel, we're not going to feel fit to undergo this kind of change that he's calling us to make through this concept of ecological conversion. So it's hope which is filled with profound faith in the work of the Holy Spirit in the community of the church, but also beyond that in the community of all people and in other religious traditions, including the indigenous religious traditions, which I started off by speaking about. So that Maasai tribe brought with their celebration of Christ also a deep sense of that indigenous attachment to the land and to their community and to other creatures. One that I found profoundly moving, and one where we can learn from them as well what it means to undergo ecological conversion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott, for inviting me. Thanks, Tom, for the generous introduction. I'm going to be looking at my watch because I know Tom is a fierce taskmaster, and I have to go to a meeting with him on Monday, and, he'll get back at me if I go over. But it's really a pleasure and an honor to be here with such a distinguished panel and to try and make a small contribution to our conversation. And I'm delighted that Celia went first because she laid a lot of background and indeed covered some of the material that I'd like to talk about from a different perspective. My focus is actually the text, Laudato Si, which is a really interesting and powerful text. And what I'm really interested in, looking at it as a contribution to Catholic social tradition, which the Pope explicitly names it as a continuation of it, is what I take to be a really unique strategy, and that is this appeal to Christian spirituality, which is densely woven into the text in a way that I think is not true of earlier encyclicals and so on. As you know, the text begins and ends with the opening words of Francis of Assisi's famous canticle, Laudato Si, or the refrain of the canticle, "Praise be to you." Il Poverello de Assisi is introduced in the preface as, quote, the example par excellence of care for the vulnerable, and of an integral ecology lived out joyfully and authentically. And he keeps popping up at key points in the text and at key sort of argumentative junctures in the way that the text proceeds. And of course, he's joined by other figures in the history of Christian spirituality, including Bonaventure, John of the Cross, Thérèse of Lisieux, and even the Sufi mystic Ali al-Khawass. So my suggestion to you that I'll try and say a little bit about is that we can't understand the encyclical and the way it's trying to generate a kind of consensus without looking at this deployment of Christian spirituality. And I also think that it represents, if you will, a development in Catholic social teachings, at least at the level of magisterial texts like this. There are a lot of ways to explore this. To get the conversation going, I'm only going to talk about 2 points at which I think we can understand the work, if you will, that Christian spirituality is doing in this beautiful text. First of all, framing the document in terms of spirituality serves the Pope's intent that the encyclical initiate a dialogue, as Celia mentioned, not only within the church and among the churches, but more broadly, indeed, and he cites John the 23rd's Pacem in Terris, with all women and men of goodwill. Now, to the extent that spirituality is a little less, if you will, doctrinally loaded, that is densely connected to one particular church or even religion, spirituality is a good starting point for this kind of dialogue. And no one is more appropriate for this than Francis of Assisi, who is beloved in all the Christian churches and among all the religions as well. Something that John Paul II recognized, you might recall, in choosing Assisi in 2002 as the place where he came together with leaders of other world religions and prayed together, which scandalized some people. In a time when people are so scandalized at things that Pope Francis done, it's worth remembering that John Paul II also scandalized people. How can you pray with members of other religious traditions? And he chose Assisi. So there's an interesting way in which sort of performatively Pope Francis is following in the footsteps of John Paul II. I also think this represents an interesting and innovative approach to a challenge that Catholic social teachings have always faced, and that is how to make an argument that is accessible and persuasive to a non-Catholic or even non-Christian audience, while also doing it in an idiom that continues to grip Christians themselves, that is, to help them understand that this is something vital to their own faith. Many times, whether unjustly or not, arguments that are framed in terms of sort of natural law or in these kind of more general or abstract principles sort of leave Christians feeling like, well, that's really great, but it doesn't really reach me and my own faith. But then trying to land completely on the Bible then makes it inaccessible to other religions. And so I think this use of spirituality in Laudato Si is a really interesting move on the Pope's part to try and frame arguments that both have traction, if you will, outside of the boundaries of the Catholic Church, but also make a powerful case to Catholics that it's integral to their own faith. So that's the first point, the connection with dialogue that the Pope insists. It's a word that he frequently uses in the text. The second point that I would like to make is that the use of spirituality for the Pope frames the scientific and economic analyses in the encyclical, and does it in terms of, as Celia already reminded us, one of his most important themes, and that is the theme of mercy and compassion as an integral part of an authentically human response to our world. And I think you can see this by using a template called See, Judge, Act, which is a well-known sort of template it began in the 30s and 40s. It's found in Gaudium et Spes, and it's particularly present in the documents of the Latin American bishops' conferences beginning at Medellin. Briefly, the idea behind this is that a Christian response to reality starts with seeing that reality as accurately as one can, using all of the resources that human reason puts at our disposal, including all of the sciences. Right? Then one judges what one sees in the light of principles of Christian faith, right? So for Catholicism, that would be both scripture and tradition. And then in the light of that, one decides how to act. So see, judge, act. And then you start all over again because your action either changed what you were judging or it didn't, both of which require a renewed analysis. And this, you can see this present, although with some very interesting twists in Laudato Si. So chapter 1 is seeing. Chapter 1 intends to draw on the results, on, quote, the results of the best scientific research available today about what is happening to our common home. So that's C. Chapters 2 and 3 judge what is seen in terms of principles drawn from the Judeo-Christian tradition, trying to get at, quote, the deepest causes of ecological crisis. And then follows with a proposal for a particular worldview, integral ecology, which Celia talked about, and then specific actions in chapter 5. So that's act, right? See, judge, act. Now, what's interesting is that that project is framed by a preface and a 6th chapter. And the preface begins with the appeal to Christian spirituality, and the 6th chapter talks about ecological conversion and about education and about spirituality. In short, the appeal to spirituality then frames or forms what I would call a kind of a lens through which our scientific seeing is refracted in order to present the world to us in a way that we can most adequately judge it. In short, having urged Francis of Assisi upon us as an exemplar of someone who has empathy and compassion both for the poor and for the earth together, and lives a life composed of a set of practices that both come out of that and feed back into it, the reading that, the scientific seeing of the world that this suggests then is one that is oriented not just by the very important scientific ideals of objectivity, reproducibility of results, and so on, but also in terms of, quote, letting the results of science touch us deeply. That's from chapter 1. Or at the beginning of chapter 1, he says, the goal of this scientific work, quote, is not to amass information or to satisfy curiosity, but rather to become painfully aware, to dare to turn what is happening to the world into our own personal suffering, and thus to discover what each of us can do about it. Right? To turn what is happening in the world into our own personal suffering. So first, let's just notice that doing this is precisely what the Pope has urged upon the Church in declaring this to be the year of mercy. But it's the suffering of the world, including the human world and the non-human natural world. Secondly, this is not something that becomes naturally or easily, which is why the encyclical ends with this chapter on education and on what will conduce to the kind of ecological conversion that Celia talked about. Conversion is not a once and for all event, but it is an ongoing process that is nourished by a set of practices as simple as praying before and after one's meals or keeping the Sabbath. That this nourishes, I would suggest, the kind of transformation that Celia was talking about, a transformation of one's heart, and I think also a transformation of the imagination. And I find this very significant because sometimes you'll find critiques of these sort of personal practices as, oh, it doesn't really change anything, right? That what's necessary are these big structural challenges. But generating a consensus for those structural challenges requires a transformation of imagination, of what's possible and what's required of us. And I think that's part of the work as well that spirituality is doing in this. That is, it's meant to reorient our imagination to counter the technocratic paradigm, which Celia talked about, which the Pope complains about in chapter 3 as a part of that judgment. Fourth, and once again, to come back to my first point, it opens points of practical dialogue with other religions, things that we can do together. And so we come back around to the first point. I also think that there are striking parallels here in the way both the ideal that the Pope is aiming for this sense of empathy, of making the suffering of the world my own, and even sort of relatively non-Christian ways of framing this task. For example, I think there's a strong parallel between this and the way that Aldo Leopold, in his classic book, Sand County Almanac, tries to figure out how can we generate an imagination that can ground what he calls the land ethic. But I don't have time to go into that, and I'm starting to get those looks from Tom. So let me just conclude. 2 quick points then, and there's lots more we could say. I think my claim here has been that this use of spirituality is really central to the argument of Laudato Si in a way that I think is unique and really interesting for people who track the development of Catholic social teachings. And in at least 2 ways. First of all, it's, I think, a rather innovative approach to dealing with this problem of how to generate consensus outside of the boundaries of the church, while also, if you will, keeping your core constituency, if I can put it that way, engaged in what you're doing. And secondly, I think that it's a crucial complement to the scriptural readings, the doctrines, the theological positions that the Pope uses to judge our current situation, and those are in those middle chapters. Since, as he says in the final chapter, quote, "A commitment this lofty cannot be sustained by doctrine alone without a spirituality capable of inspiring us, without an interior impulse which encourages, motivates, nourishes, and gives meaning to our individual and communal activity." Thank you.
Well, speaking of outside the boundaries of the church, I want to thank the organizers of this very important meeting for inviting me, and actually Pope Francis for inviting me in a larger sense, a Jew, to talk about Laudato Si. It's been very moving to me to hear these wonderful stories about such good acts that are already taking place. Every single moral gesture matters so much. It's very moving, and I'm excited by them. It's a pleasure to speak Torah at Notre Dame as you open your new school by addressing the single most important issue of our time, the moral issue of climate change, and how it already has begun to deepen the suffering of the poor who bear the name of God, and to us who bear the name of God, who we are pledged to serve. I want to thank my colleague, Tom Tweed, and my teacher, Gustavo Gutierrez, who long ago at GTU taught this Orthodox Jew liberation theology. It's shaped my work ever since. But mostly, I'm here today to say the Shema, the prayer we are liturgically commanded to call out 2 times a day, every morning and every evening, for we yearn to live, as Devarim 11 reminds us, always in this land which Hashem, your God, cares for. The eyes of Hashem, your God, are always upon it, from the beginning of the year even to the end of the year. And it will come to pass, if you listen constantly and diligently to my commandments, that I command you this day, to love Hashem, your God, and to serve God with all your heart and with all your soul, then I will give the rain of your land in its right season, the early rains and the late rains, so that you may gather in your grain and your wine and your oil. And I will give grass in your fields for your cattle, and you shall eat and be satisfied. Watch yourselves, beware, because your heart can be deceived and seduced, and you will turn away astray and serve other gods and bow down to them. Then the anger of Hashem will blaze against you, and he will shut up the heavens, so there will be no rain, and the ground shall not yield her fruit, and you shall quickly be banished, starving, dying from off the good land which Hashem gives you. You must place these words of mine on your heart and on your soul, and you must bind them for a sign upon your arm, and they shall be like a sign right between your eyes. And you must teach them to your children, talking of them, arguing about them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the road, and when you lie down to sleep, and when you rise up in the morning. And you shall write them on the doorpost of your house, write them everywhere on your gates, in order to prolong their days and days of your children, living on the very ground that Hashem has promised to your ancestors to give them as long as the heavens are above the earth. It couldn't be clearer or more forthright. Be good or else. Justice, the Sabbath, the care of the stranger, the ordering law, and the narrative of exile, the grace of God. You must repeat this all. You must speak of it. For it is your covenant, persons and God. It keeps the world a good world, and it can all disappear. So let us talk. These brief remarks here enact my duty, actually, to speak of this promise, to speak of these words. First, I want to make 3 points. I come as a Jewish scholar in praise and admiration for Laudato Si. It is a major statement by a faith leader about the urgent contemporary catastrophe in a time of really astonishing denial. It links climate change to the desperate poverty and the unrelenting cruelty that are the inevitable result out of our lack of control of the sinful global capitalism that serves us. It reminds us that Scripture is always about moral action. And like every single scientist on this planet, the Pope, also a scientist, has insisted on the grim gravity of our situation, frail, breakable humanity, who must, one by one, lift our hands to bear this burden. It would be an impossible task if we did not remember what God's people have already done: face down Pharaoh, challenge the Roman Empire. Second, Jewish theology has long linked care for the planet to the issue of social justice. The heavens will shut its skies. There will be no rain, is the punishment for injustice to the poor. We are obligated by Hebrew scriptures to care for the poor, the marginal, the desperate, hungry one. When we do this, it's not because we're nice or charitable or that it's tax deductible. We do this because we have this season, right? We do this because we have bound the words of Torah to our bodies, flat out, right between our eyes. Tzedakah, the word for charity in Hebrew, is the same word for justice, tzedek. And we give tzedakah because it is a public act that means we understand that we live in a theopolitical economy. That economy is far more important than the marketplace, which deceives and seduces and tells the enormous lie that the earth can be destroyed, its energy sucked off and burned for profit. We don't say, look at me, I'm so kind. We ought to say, look at God's world, in which the poor are central actors in the working out of moral order. Look how abundant are the corners of the field, which belong to the poor. Look at the richness of the second harvest, which belongs to the poor. And in Jerusalem and Rome and Medina, look at our awesome God who cares for the land so we can care for the poor, so we can steward the land so that it will be abundant and green and golden all the way to the corners. And we do not say, says Deuteronomy, the entire productive cycle will stop, because what is it all for if we don't do this? What is the abundance of it for? The way it returns, really, despite everything and all our petty sins, if it is not for the poor. Third, we face a moment when our own denial blinds us. And our denial is worse because, well, we know better. We trust science. We forget the great sacrifice at the heart of Torah, pages and pages of blood and fire, our favorite lamb, the first one, our only cow, the one we've named. It's all given to the glory of God, to the priests who live without land, to the poor who live without bread. Every single person, beggar to king, lives in a world of deep sacrifice. But we forget the loss. We forget the loss of the temple and the cross, and at the heart of faith, that's where it is, the loss. Which is why we can so easily forget how hard the world is if you live, say, in northern Syria, where when the drought came and there was no choice but to walk into the most uncertain futures, or how hard it is to be poor and pregnant and living in a favela ridden with Zika mosquitoes. We live in such a pretty word on this campus, the academy, it's so beautiful, that we can forget for the poor, climate change has already destroyed their world. We forget we must do everything, at least a radical something, and that will be a sacrifice and that we must do it now. The Pope talks in his home and he talks on the road where he walks, and that's an example of how we must live now. But where are the scholars? And what is our duty? How do we take the desperate, hungry one into our homes? To answer that question, in a longer work that Tom alluded to, I argued that we have duties that arise because we teach the texts that promise mercy to the refugee, and thus scholars of religion in particular should surely know better. I suggested that we remember the Torah's concept of a mandatory sabbatical year, a Shemitah year, that forces us just to stop the frantic work of production and allows the earth to rest. It allows debts to be canceled. It allows us to open the borders of what we think is ours, to let the poor take what food they need. It's my hope that we can make our world a good place like that, campus by campus, and neighbor by neighbor, act by act, and yes, prayer by prayer, our energy and our love, the most renewable of energies. As some of you know, I called on the AAR in 2014. In the last sabbatical year, Jews have been counting, 5,775. When I called for us to stop at the sabbatical year in the year 2021, 5,782, I called for this year of reflection and study and also service in one's own city. I asked all my colleagues not to fly on airplanes to hotels. This carbon output may be the greatest single amount any random academic has. I asked for that whole year, not to fly on business, including the business of the American Academy of Religion, including all our climate change conferences, flying to Morocco, right? And any other business, including other academic meetings. I also asked everyone to tithe their time, to tithe their production, to tithe their research and their teaching. Now, I know it's going to be a big sacrifice, and it will be very, very hard, and maybe nobody but me and Tom will do it, but there you go. But listen, it's not harder than many other tasks that people of faith have faced. Remember those Romans? It's my contention that we need something like that, some bold and courageous action, the sort of action called for in the texts we study, and the sort of action if we really, really understood that humanity, our children, our students, we're all facing the greatest moral challenge of our time. We are forewarned. We have liturgy, we have Torah, we have history, we have narratives. We have scientists shouting, look at this. And each of you and me, we need to understand that this chance, it may be our last chance. Here are the headlines from last week. For half a century, climate scientists have seen the West Antarctic ice sheet, a remnant of the last ice age, as a sword of Damocles hanging over human civilization. The Great Ice Sheet, larger than Mexico, is thought to be potentially vulnerable to disintegration from a relatively small amount of global warming and capable of raising the sea level by 12 feet or more should it break up. But researchers long assumed that the worst effects would take hundreds, if not thousands, of years to occur. Now, new research suggests that the disaster scenario could play out much sooner. Continued high emissions of heat-trapping gases could launch a disintegration of the ice sheet within decades, according to a study published March 31st, heaving enough water into the ocean to raise the sea level by as much as 3 feet alone by the end of the century. New York Times, front page, there it is. I grew up on a cove on the California coast. And when I was little, we would walk out to the big rocks at low tide and we would name them. You could walk along the wide yellow sand beaches for miles, but not now. Now the cove fills with water, and at high tide, the big Pacific waves heave already nearly to the roadway. The rocks are always under the seawater. Guard rock, rock that looks like a buffalo, bird rock. My son has never seen those low tides, I knew, and his daughter, my grandchild, will grow up in the next 85 years, God willing, during which this cove and this road and this coast and this city, Los Angeles, where a full 20% of the people who live there live below the poverty line. It will all be underwater. Unless we're really able to speak in our homes and along the road, and unless we're able to act. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much. Scott, and to panelists here and everyone here, what a great pleasure to be here. I have to switch the key. You got us up the mountain. I'm still at the base here. What is happening? I'm a reporter for what's going on. It's not in the headlines. In the headlines are the extreme abuses of religion, the lacerating pain of religion being misused and used even to justify the most extreme forms of violence and cruelty against one another. But that's not the real story. That's a terrible reality, but it's not the large story that's afoot. And I'm reporting from the field that all over the world, from villages to middle-sized towns, to capitals, to centers of religion, religious communities and the representatives are gathering. And they're gathering in a very special way by placing problems at the very center of the table. There are specialized dialogues that continue on religious meanings, dialogues among scholars, among monks, and so forth. But there is a dialogue of life and a dialogue of justice that is now pervasive and going on around the world. I think personally that it is unstoppable. And I've witnessed people who were deeply suspicious of it, and in their own short experience now, become the greatest proponents of it. Archbishop Sorondo, when you convened scientists, you also, before the encyclical, you also convened religious leaders, and I had the pleasure of being with you and assisting in a small way in that. So it's now normal for all of us to find that the religious communities are gathering. Now, one of the blessings of our time in history is that we are aware of how dynamic the unfolding of time is. And the religious communities, as they have moved across cultures or confronted challenges, have had to engage in, and I'm simplifying a very complicated process, have had to engage in two fundamental processes. They've had to rehear their own tradition vis-a-vis the challenge. So if today the religious communities are gathered around the challenges of climate change and of sustainable development, those problems are now driving all of the people of all the different religions to go back and re-inventory, re-marshal, re-examine their own particular faith heritage. And that's a very creative act. Not everything in one's tradition perhaps stands out vis-a-vis the particular challenges that we're confronting. And if they rehear it, they have to re-say it. And what does it mean to be a Buddhist today in light of climate change? What does it mean to be a Jew or a Muslim or a Hindu or a Christian or any of the other religions? Now that re-saying is happening on two fronts and in two different kinds of language. There are Jews gathered as Jews using the primary resources of Judaism, the primary language of Judaism, and deciding among Jews, this is what it means to be a Jew today as we are living in front of these problems. But there's a second idiom, because Jews and Christians and Muslims and all of us know that there are many who are not part of our faith tradition. So we are learning to speak, to re-say who we are in public ways. And it's my second point that the area of multi-religious cooperation gathers around the issue of the ethical, the shared conviction, the deeply held and widely shared, even if Jews have their own way to anchor this, and Christians and Buddhists and Hindus and Muslims, etc., have their respective ways. So we're in that moment where all of us are remaking our traditions by the immensity and rapidity of the challenges that we're facing. And secondly, we're all remaking them because who shows up around that challenge is the other religion. And so when I have to examine who I am in terms of my own religious identity, I'm here representing multi-religious cooperation. I am a Roman Catholic and a believer in my own faith. Then I have to retrieve it vis-a-vis the particular challenges we're facing and the obvious commitment and goodwill of the others who are joining me to try to solve that particular kind of challenge. This is, I think, these are the two great drivers of traditioning. And we are being driven together because of the fact that the challenges are common challenges. I mentioned that multi-religious cooperation is based on moral consensus, and it's not surprising, and at times I think this can be misunderstood and can seem to appear to be a kind of lowest common denominatorism. So it's not surprising if I would report that The diverse religious traditions are expressing a conviction, each in their own way, that the rich interconnectedness of all reality, including our reality as human beings within the cosmos. And all of them have the experience of the beauty, the awe, and the mystery of the experience of existing in the world, and what we would, in some traditions, call creation. And we all have the tradition of massive self-contradiction, that in fact our acts are poisoning and undercutting the very conditions of possibility of our flourishing. The carbon chemistry is the big example of this. And Matt, sort of as the see, judge, act, the religious communities in this multi-religious configuration are seeing in ways that are quite similar, and judging that this is a moral issue, and indeed deciding that they have to act. Here, I think I would like to risk a complicated point that I was sharing with you, Bishop Sorondo. I'm convinced, and there's been several decades that I've had the pleasure of gaining this conviction, that the multi-religious experience is not, or at least need not, become a sort of watering down of the religious particularity, and that in fact it may provide an extraordinary key to achieving an insight or an embrace of one's own particularity. I'm going to use a funny analogy for this purpose. I'll draw it from Roman Catholicism, but I think it's useful, and if it succeeds, bravo. If it doesn't, you won't be injured by it. For those in the Catholic tradition, there is a fairly wide awareness of how St. Thomas embraced the work of Aristotle, and embraced the work of Aristotle's understanding of ethics, including what Aristotle called the cardinal virtues: prudence and justice, courage and temperance. And out of these virtues was going to be the orientation of the moral person or the moral community in life. But Thomas, of course, adjusts Aristotle. And there are three other virtues that Thomas focuses on. And these are called theological virtues. And these virtues basically are habits, moral habits. These virtues are faith, hope, and charity. The subtle point, and I'll draw the analogy back to the interreligious, the subtle point that Thomas is making is not only that those three theological virtues lead deeper and further into the mystery of the origin of our existence, the mystery of God, but they also work backwards. They refigure prudence. They recenter prudence. They purify prudence. They do the same for justice, and for the same for courage and for temperance. The higher, if you will, embraces and refigures, purifies, maybe heals what is accessible. This was expressed often as the conviction that faith and reason would co-abide, and that faith wouldn't sacrifice reason. Faith would actually help to heal reason if it becomes so easily lost from itself. So what I use this analogy for is that while Buddhists come to dialogue and collaborate with Jews and Muslims, Buddhists at their best are not leaving their experience of the eternal mercy of the Buddha. They are committed to those simple areas of moral consensus, but with the mass momentum, with the drive that you brought into the room as a convinced Jew. And that's the possibility for all of us, that in fact we are shaping each other, we are arriving at areas of deep moral convergence, but we are fueled in those convergences by the profound particularities of our originating experiences of the sacred. And this provides something quite extraordinary for all of us. It does two things. On the one hand, it invites something very exquisite that's, I think, underway in our age, a kind of mutual self-mediation between our religious communities. All around the world, I've seen bishops or imams or monks gently nudge with the elbow a person of a different faith sitting beside them and say to them, you know, you understand me better than some of my own people. They're not speaking about the fact that they have weakened in their religious experience. They are recognizing through the lens of the person's otherness and their maturity dimensions of their own sacred heritage. I'll make one more point about what I think is so transformational in our own time with our religious communities, dealing honestly and squarely, confronting the challenges that are all of their challenges and all of ours. We have a lot of work in multi-religious funding for large projects, conflict resolution, HIV/AIDS projects, development, now environmental work. And our donors, which are governments and foundations, want to make sure that we are doing that work well. So they're involved in monitoring and evaluation. But we decided that, and that's a good thing, we decided we ought to monitor what's happening to us who are doing the multi-religious work. How is this changing us? And so in very humble ways, we began to literally engage those involved in self-inventory. What's happened to you? What was it like before you began to cooperate? How has this altered you? And 4 remarkable trend lines have emerged, and these are cross continents and cross religions. Not surprisingly, virtually everybody reports an enormous increase in the image of the other, where they were frightened, apprehensive, somewhat suspicious. This melts quickly into a very deep appreciation of the otherness of those who are other. Secondly, they're willing to cooperate. Once you have crossed the river of cooperation, I know of almost no one who wants to go back and park on the other side of the river. Third, and this is extremely touching to me personally, and it's validated in my own experience, but I'm reporting broadly, people report falling more in love with their own religion after they are working shoulder to shoulder with people of other convictions, commitments, caring, unrestricted caring about the problems that we are discussing, we're facing. And back to our opening, it's this falling in love with one's own religion that is, in fact, a kind of conversion. And from that conversion, people then see differently, perceive differently, judge differently, value differently. And so the odd, beautiful opportunity of our own day is that there is an ever greater solidarity growing among people of passionate conviction for their own particular religious commitments. And surely that could apply to people who have other warrants for conviction as well. I'll conclude because with one final point. Scott, you asked me to make at least a brief comment on the question of peace. And here, it has to be terribly brief, but let me share that there is an emerging conviction. First of all, the religious communities have positive visions of peace. They're not negative visions. They are anticipatory notions of what it would mean to flourish in harmony with oneself, with others, with creation, and with the source of our existence. But in the interreligious space, there is an emergent consensus that what we heard over lunch and the common good, human dignity and the common good, are in a unbreakable reciprocity. We will not be able to have the human dignity without advancing the human good, and that these two are, of course, situated within the wider cosmos and therefore involve our communion and our care for our shared home. So with that, I open just brief remarks, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much to my colleagues. We could talk among ourselves forever, I think, for hours, but we won't do that because we know that our friend Gustavo Gutierrez is following at 5:30. We have a time for a few questions, and in this year of mercy, we will be gracious and kind as we pass microphones to the folks who want to raise a question. So if you have a question, let us know and we will get you a microphone.
Thanks. My name is Leah Ash. I'm a Notre Dame alumna. Dr. Zoloth, one of the things that you mentioned, or some of the hints that you gave in your delivery, was that the changes needed are radical ones rather than incremental ones, and that radical acts of protest and change at both personal and societal levels are what's needed. And Dr. Ashley, I think you pointed to something similar when you emphasized the line that Pope Francis wrote in Laudato Si, that to turn what is happening in the world into our own personal suffering also suggests, or could be made to suggest a certain sort of radicality in our response. Yet most of the changes that I hear spoken about don't impose much radicality on our society, for example. Can you suggest some ways in which we might embrace a radical response?
Matt or Laurie?
Okay.
Not traveling to a conference, are you kidding me? What about my frequent flyer miles?
Flyer miles and then special seats. Yeah. So I have a few, I take this seriously, and Scott, this is for you because you asked. I don't think you should serve meat at this school. If you really care about international global poverty, I think, what are you doing serving meat? I mean, really, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be totally offensive, but meat is 65% of the greenhouse gas emissions of a normal human being's diet, right? And so there's no justification for doing it. So every single gesture has to be re-examined in light of the catastrophe, in light of the Antarctica melting. So I don't think you should eat meat. I think you should not fly on business in that once every 7 years, you could take a year and do what the Torah says. No, don't work the land. Don't work your land, as it were. Stay home. Feed your own Levites, right? So that's one thing. I think you should try to bike instead of drive. I think you should try to take public transportation at all times, even when it's wet and rainy. I still bike in that kind of self-suffering way that I'm so fond of. But see, what it means for a woman, for instance, I don't wear tefillin because I'm an Orthodox Jewish woman, right? But you have to bind the words in some visible way, some sign that your body is committed to God. Your life is committed to God, right? And so you have to show your students and you have to show your neighbors that you're really willing to act as if you have to be at the 2050 goals, as if you have that much reduction of carbon in your life. And I think that means many, many, many dozens of individual regrets and sufferings and sacrifices that are a drag, basically, but because we're used to a very comfortable life. And it also means never forgetting that we have to really push on social justice in the wider sphere. But saying, I know it needs systemic change, right? I know we need an Amtrak system that really works. Saying that gets you off the hook if then you go and you eat your cow and you eat, and you drive your car and you wear clothes that you can't feel like you need to get clothes all the time. So all of those seductive parts of capitalism, we just have to stop doing it. We have to wear it as a sign on our bodies that we're willing to change our lives now. And so that's what I suggest, both
Great.
the small things and the large things.
I think we wanted radical change. It was a little bit easier on us, but
Yeah.
I hear what you're saying. Matt, did you want to jump in before we went to the next question?
I mean, I think that's really great and terrific.
But
I still want to fly.
So-
But I do think also that, radical change is important. My way of thinking about this is that because it does represent the prophetic tradition, but there is also a wisdom tradition. And there's a way, I think the wisdom tradition, like saying the Psalms, I think is a radical act. Not in the same way, but because I do think it's about a transformation of the imagination. And these sort of simple actions that might not seem that radical do actually kind of reframe the way we see things. Because, the real question is, how do you actually experience the suffering that's going on in the world as your own suffering? And I think the prophetic which I'm sort of identifying the prophetic and the radical is really important. But, to bring up Aldo Leopold, something as simple as having to go out and chop your own wood. Because you don't know, you realize, wow, heat just doesn't come from pushing a little switch.
Yeah.
So, maybe the idea is that's more
You
internally
can't-
oriented.
You can't chop wood and burn it anymore. It's like wood.
Well, you can't do that either. Yeah, I know that. But so I do think that the radical is really important, but I also think that the everyday
No, I agree. I think
is a
it's-
part of a transformation of the way we see the world, and that I think you need both of them.
No, I agree. We agree.
Yes.
We do.
We do.
Ibrahim.
So I don't want to make a long speech in terms of my motivation, but I just want to telegraph two questions. One is, on the one hand, I see that Laudato Si has an element of an enchanted world, and the way in which we need to think about how listen to the flowers and to the mountains and to the earth, and on the other side also the best science. So this morning we heard that possibly nuclear energy could be one of our solutions in terms of the crisis. So do we have to begin to think about science as also part of providence? And how would that new science look? A number of theologians who also work on science here, so I'm posing that question. The other thing is fossil fuels, and the second question is about theodicy. What does divine justice look like with fossil fuels? Is fossil fuel the new evil?
As long as they're easy questions, Ibrahim,
Right.
thank you. Celia or Bill, would you like to take a stab at that?
Yeah, you asked about a new science, and I think one of the things that struck me reading the encyclical was how much praise there was for ecologists and for those working in conservation, and that kind of area of understanding the basic relationships between people and different ecosystems. Ecosystems came up a lot as well. And I think part of the problem is that science as such sometimes thinks that it can simply just provide solutions just like that without what I would call patient observation, that the kind of observation you get with ecologists and with those who are working in the systems. Because I've been working with anthropologists and also with psychologists in the last couple of years, and one thing that has struck me is how complex everything is. So it's not. So in other words, it would be very easy to make big mistakes. So geoengineering, for example, which wasn't talked about this morning, that would have been my question to the panel. If you want to push this, how far are you actually going to push for geoengineering solutions? And part of the difficulty I have is that some of these so-called solutions aren't necessarily solutions before because they're so unpredictable. So I think we need to get back in the way that my colleagues here have suggested to some of the simple changes that we might make to where it is more manageable. So instead of sort of large geoengineering schemes, think about agriculture, alternative agriculture of the type that Wendell Berry and a few others have discussed. Replanting crops that have deeper roots so that they're not going to dry out as climate change gets under the way and so on. So there are things, and I was originally a plant physiologist and an agricultural botanist, and I know there are some things that you can do which are relatively small, but they're not driven by the global economy. So I think it's about trying to look at the goods to which science is aimed. Is it the goods of the global economy, or is it some other kind of good, the common good, and trying to work it towards that rather than other sort of goals. So we're trying to look at the overall process of where science is orientated and the kinds of questions that it's asking, and the purpose of those questions. So that's, if you like, what I would call bringing in wisdom or practical wisdom into the practices of science as well, rather than simply increasing our information or other ways in which it tends to be driven through the corporate and multinational companies and so on. That's probably quite enough from me.
Great.
So.
Bill, do you want to have our last word on that point?
On that point. Well,
Our last word also.
We're all indebted to science, and it's rooted in the primordial wonder that we have, the fact that we incessantly ask questions. I think that science itself is reflective about what it's doing when it does science, but not always fully reflective about it. The scientist is doing science. And so the scientist is conscious as the scientist does science. So there's a range of data within the performance of science that is not really reflected yet by most scientists. So they are doing things as scientists and as inquirers that are not reducible to the physiology of neural cells. And so I think we should have a very open, very positive sense that human inquiry will win in terms of the breadth of our thirst to both know and to care. And I think we've gone through one stage, and I think there's room to imagine further development for us.
That's a wonderful note to end on. Again, Gustavo Gutierrez in this room at 5:30. Please,
Which is now.
well, I was trying not to point out that it is 5:30. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists.